Okay, welcome back for the next lecture. And before I start, I would like to introduce myself a little bit, or the institute where I'm working, NORDITA. It's Nordic Institute for Theoretical Physics. So I'm a theoretician, and I'm also going to present you a whiteboard or blackboard presentation. So I will write in the old-fashioned way with the chalk on the blackboard, most parts of the lecture in any case. And yeah, as I said, Nordic Institute for Theoretical Physics. I have been there since 10 years, and it's an institute maybe quite comparable to the one here. So we have fixed staff there working on all kinds of problems in theoretical physics, from particle physics over astronomy, astrobiology, hard condensed matter, soft condensed matter, statistical physics, climate, a quite broad range of research topics. We have 3 fixed faculty staff, a number of assistant professors, a larger number of postdocs, and then PhD students if we get grants to pay them. And there's also a large activity concerning conferences, and we also have schools. So this is a large part, not only research, but also organizing conferences and meetings. And there's, for instance, one, I don't know if you can read it, Are There Universal Laws in Non-Equilibrium Statistical Physics, which I co-organize in the fall this year. So if you're interested, you can check the webpage and maybe even apply for the conference. NORDITA has been founded in the 50s in Copenhagen. I think even Niels Bohr was involved in the founding process. It was very close to the Niels Bohr Institute for a very long time in Copenhagen. And then in 2007, it moved to Stockholm. And since then, it's in Sweden, in Stockholm. And we are there in close proximity to the university, Stockholm University and KTH, and we have a lot of collaborations going on there. So it's a very lively environment with a lot of different input, lots of conference seminars. So it's a great place to work there and get inspired. Okay, and so much about the institute. And what I want to talk about to you is related to the last picture that Fernando showed. It's this object, this protein, I think it was, right? And for you, it was already the spherical cow. For me, it's still way too complicated. So I go to the super spherical cow, maybe. So I'm thinking about more like just spherical particles in solution and what's going to happen to them. And if they are just in solution, they perform something which is called Brownian motion. And this is the basic topic of my presentation. In a way, I will specify it in more detail. And I would like to show you this video here, where he talks a little bit about Brownian motion. And this is, this is actually something my son discovered, because now, he's like 15 now, and most of the information they get from YouTube videos. And a few weeks ago, he came to me and said, hey, this is the guy, he's called himself Action Lab. He's actually doing great stuff. It's very, very entertaining to watch him. And so my son came to me and said, hey, today I watched this video from the Action Lab guy, and he was talking about Brownian motion. Isn't that you're working with? And I said, yes, indeed. So let's see what he's going to say. He's also talking about other stuff. I will skip that, but in the beginning,
things really small.
Really small.
So I'm going to be using some really small particles to show you what happens when they're introduced to heat, and then also show you how you can use really small particles to actually prove the existence of atoms. So I have here a powder called Lycopodium clavatum. And what Lycopodium powder is, it's actually just common club moss seeds or spores. And they're extremely small, and they have a very high surface area because they have little protrusions coming off of them, kind of like little spikes, and those spikes cause it to have a lot of surface area. Now when something...
Okay, this part I will skip. it was only to introduce the particles. I actually no idea where he gets these particles from, these spores. But the interesting part for us starts about here. So let's see. Yes.
Is what actually keeps the water off the surface. Then once you remove that air, then the water can contact it just like normal, and it's no longer hydrophobic. Now this lycopodium is so small, each individual granule is around 30 microns in diameter. And when you have something that small, what's interesting is you can actually start to see Brownian motion. Now let me explain what Brownian motion is if you're not familiar with it. So we know that everything around us is made up of atoms, and those atoms and molecules are constantly jiggling and moving around. If they have a temperature above absolute zero, they're always moving. And because of this constant motion, it's actually a way to prove that these atoms and molecules actually exist. For example, let's say these Orbeez are my atoms or molecules.
Desde cedo te ensinaram que você tem que ser discreta.
Molecules. They're not just sitting there like this. They're actually always in constant motion because they have energy. They have kinetic energy, and they're just like balls that are bouncing off each other. So they're continually in motion like this. But all of these atoms and molecules around us are too small to see. But what we can see is something bigger. So for example, let's say I was trying to prove that these Orbeez exist, but they're too small for me to see. But I can see a big ball like this. Well, then all I do is I put my ball under the microscope, and you'll notice that it slightly jiggles. So if you see a big thing like this kind of jiggling back and forth, you can actually deduce that the reason it's jiggling is because there's a bunch of smaller things constantly hitting it. And the constant bashing into it of these smaller balls is causing the bigger ball to kind of jitter around. So this constant jittering is called Brownian motion, and it's actually one of the first proofs of the atomic theory. It sounds kind of weird to say atomic theory because we're so used to talking about atoms and molecules now. But before we could use other methods to actually prove their existence, one of the only methods we could use is to look at bigger things jiggling around and assume that there's smaller things hitting them, like atoms and molecules. So today what I want to do is see if you can actually see Brownian motion by sticking these lycopodium powder granules in water and putting it on a slide under my microscope and seeing if we can actually see them jitter and move around a little bit. So all I do is get a drop of water, put some powder on it, and then put my top slide on. Then all you do is look at it under the microscope. Okay, so let's see if we can see these spores. That's just a bubble in there. So let's zoom in on these. Okay. You can zoomed in a little bit more, you can start to see these individual spores a little bit more. So we want to zoom in close enough where we can actually see the vibration caused by the constant movement of the water molecules. Let's zoom in a little bit more. Oh, we can see 3 of them right there. So you can see they're round because as I change the zoom, you can start to see the top of it, the middle of them, and the bottom of them. I'm just going to zoom it and focus it about right there. Okay, now I'm not touching it anymore. Let's see if we can see these guys move. You can see that one on the right slightly twisting a little bit. So you can see the one on the bottom right there. You can see it kind of jiggling and turning different directions a little bit.
So this is a little bit difficult to see here because he said, I think the particles are 30 micrometer in size. So it's sort of the upper limit. You can see the jiggling by bare eye. But let's see what he's going to do next.
So this is called Brownian motion, and it's completely random. It's dependent on the random motions of the water molecules bumping back and forth on this moss. So the reason we're not able to see some really big jiggling motion is because in comparison to the water molecules, these lycopodium granules are very big. But if we can get some smaller balls in there, then those small balls will actually be a lot more visible jittery motion. So a way to do that is actually pretty easy. All you need is some milk mixed with water and put some food coloring in it, like I've done here. And then you just put a drop of it on your slide and put a glass slide over the top, and now look what it looks like. So this is at 400 times magnification right now. And at this magnification, you can see those tiny little spheres of fat globules in there. They're now getting bumped around by the water molecules. So they're taking these random paths through the water. So this is amazing. You can totally see the jittery motion of those fat globules in there. So with something as simple as a microscope and some milk and food coloring or even some lycopodium, you can actually indirectly prove the existence of atoms and molecules. Hey everyone, thanks for watching another episode of the Action Lab. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something.
Okay. Let's see. So what you have just seen, this wiggling motion, this actually happens with all the proteins and DNA fragments and whatever is swimming around in your cells. It's happening on that scale. And that's one reason that it's so extremely important to understand what this is and to develop a model for that. And this is what I'm going to talk about in the following. But one question this guy did not answer. The question is, why is it called Brownian motion, right? And the reason is these two publications. They are, the author is hard to find. It's here, Robert Brown, and here, Robert Brown. So both by the same author, and published 1828 to 1829. So this guy has been a botanist. One reads he was quite famous at his time for studying new plants he brought home from a long journey to, I don't remember where, 2 years or something like that. He got quite famous for that. And then he started studying, he found under the microscope that small particles from these plants, actually particles that came out of the spores from these plants, were jiggling around. And he got very interested in that phenomenon and was studying it in great, great detail. He was not the only one seeing it, so he did not discover this Brownian motion. Once the microscope was invented, basically everybody could see it, more or less. But he studied it very, very systematically because you imagine this was 1828, or his study was actually, here it's the title, A Brief Account of Microscopical Observations Made in the Month of June, July, and August 1827 on the particles contained in the pollen of plants and on the general existence of active molecules in organic and inorganic bodies. Okay, that was his title. So this was 1827. Imagine that matter existed of atoms was not accepted at all at that time. So this is also the reason the Action Lab guy was referring to the atomic hypothesis so often, because this was really, after Einstein, I'm going to explain that, was really one way to prove that atoms exist, that atoms actually exist. It was not known at that time. So he observed this, but they had no clue why these particles were moving in that way. So one obvious question, of course, I mean, he ruled out on this microscope that there were some flows in the drop or whatever. These things he ruled out. But one possible question was, is it because these objects are alive, because they come from pollens of the plants? Do they have some life force which is moving them around? And this was one question he tried to answer by studying many, many, many different materials, organic and inorganic materials. And he always found the same thing. He even tried to kill the pollen particles by putting them into alcohol for several, I don't know, days or weeks, and did the same experiment, and they still were moving. Okay? His studies, his systematic studies, are the reason that this phenomenon is named after this botanist, Robert Brown. So this is Brownian motion. And there's another peculiar thing in these titles of the two papers, namely he's talking about the existence of active molecules. Here it's the same, remarks on active molecules. And first of all, the term molecule here is not used in the sense we use it today. What he means is particles, small particles, what we would name particles. And then, because they were moving around like it looked like actively, he called them active molecules. But nowadays, we actually call exactly this passive Brownian motion, because we know that these particles, these colloidal particles, they don't move on their own. They are just pushed around by the collisions with the water molecules. So we call this nowadays passive Brownian motion. But we also have something which is active Brownian motion, which is a field which has become more and more lively and active in the recent years. It's related to active matter. And we actually have lectures on that too by Julia. I think on Wednesday, it's the first one, right? So this is what we nowadays understand under active matter. These particles in active matter, they actually move on their own. So these are suspensions of bacteria, for instance, which can self-propel in a certain way. And still, they self-propel, but still have this Brownian motion effect, so wiggling as well. So in these systems, we have additional new effects, which are studied in the field of active matter. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm focusing on passive Brownian motion. So actually, these particles that have been studied by Brown himself. Okay, and before I start, I would like to give you a list of references. Of course, there are many, many more publications, but this one I find particularly useful. Some of them appeared in connection with 100 years of Brownian motion, because Einstein published his explanation of Brownian motion in his Annus Mirabilis, 1905. They also published the work on the photo effect and on special relativity. So there was some special issues, and then there are many, many books. I particularly like the Gardiner here and Van Kampen, and then there is this famous review by Chandrasekhar, which people still think it's a classics and a must-read. And I recently also found this article here published in a signal processing journal, but it's a very interesting account of the history of noise, so how the history behind this Brownian motion effect developed. Okay, I can keep this up, but as you heard from Fernando, this will also appear on the web page. And now I'm switching to the blackboard. And as said, I'm starting from here, so I hope you can follow. The system we are going to study is, let's say, we start with just one colloidal particle. So a spherical colloidal particle, which is suspended in water and is kicked around by the water molecules all the time. And what we want is, we want to understand these effects. We want to find a simple model, let's say, a simple model for this effect, which is called Brownian motion. Or I could also say, in the end, I would like to find an equation of motion describing this effect. Of course, I mean, in principle, I could describe this thing on the level that also Fernando mentioned in his talk. In a way, I could write down the Newton equation for all the particles involved. That means this colloidal object and then all the water molecules. And then I have a complete set of equations. I could solve it and see what happens. But this does not help me so much to really understanding the physics of these things. I would like to have a simpler model. In particular, very often I'm not at all interested in the motion of all the water molecules. So I want to have a more coarse-grained description of the thing, a more like effective description. And I want to include the effect of the water molecules in a more simplified way. In the end, this thing here, the equation of motion, this also has been mentioned by Fernando before, will lead to the Langevin equation. This is what Fernando mentioned in one of his slides under Langevin dynamics. This is this equation. And as said, since basically any object on the micrometer scale feels this Brownian motion, it's a very, very important theory. And in addition, this development of the theory for Brownian motion initiated the development of the theory of stochastic processes in a more general setting. And stochastic processes find application nowadays almost everywhere. In economy, in biology, in chemistry. There have been Nobel Prizes in economy, for instance. So this is a very important class of models. And now Fernando also mentioned that typically these systems have charges. So this object may be charged. And then we would have to consider what these charge effects are doing. And this will lead to Poisson-Boltzmann equations and so on. And most likely I will not focus on these things. I will consider the object just the bare spherical object, because I rather would like to present you some more recent developments in the theory of Brownian motion, which go from the dynamics to the thermodynamics. So people more recently tried to develop a thermodynamic description for Brownian motion on a trajectory level. I will come to that a little bit later and explain in more detail what I mean. But this is what I would rather like to do. Okay, this is more or less our setting, very simple. And I would like to follow for a while Einstein's footsteps in presenting that to you. So when Brownian motion has been observed, I told you already, nobody really understood why these colloidal particles were wiggling around. And nobody really paid much attention either until Einstein published his paper in 1905. And this paper is actually based on the idea that matter is made of atoms, that there are atoms which hit this object and move it around. But before Einstein, the phenomenon of diffusion was well known, but it was a separate thing. Right? It was not clear that Brownian motion and diffusion are related. Now we know that Brownian motion is like the cause of the phenomenon of diffusion. But that days, it was not known. What was known about diffusion was on a phenomenological level. And this is called the Fick's laws of diffusion. And the first law says that the diffusion flux between 2 points, this comes just from observation. It's a phenomenological law. So you observe things and you write down a theory for that. Diffusion flux is proportional to the concentration gradient. So in an equation, if I have the flux J, this is proportional to, I write it down in one dimension, d rho dx, and the rho is the particle concentration. And J is the flux density. So it's the number of particles crossing a surface, a unit area per unit time. And this D is the diffusion coefficient. This is a phenomenological coefficient which describes how strong this effect is. And the minus sign here is because the particles, the flux is not up the gradient but down the gradient, okay? So this is Fick's first law. The second law is basically mass conservation or particle number conservation. So it says that the time change of the particle concentration is minus the divergence of the flux, and in one dimension it's just minus dj dx. So this tells you that if you consider a certain region in space and you monitor how the concentration of particles is changing in time in that region, it's given by everything that flows out or into that region in space. This is the differential form of that. Then you combine these two equations here, and you get that the time change of the concentration is d square dx square. And this is in 1D the diffusion equation. And it has been written down in 1856. Okay, so this was known, but on a phenomenological level. And now one had this observation of Brownian motion, and then 1905, Einstein's paper. And there are actually two parts in that paper. But both parts are based on this key insight that this motion is caused by the collisions with the water molecules. Okay? So Brownian motion is caused by the collisions with the water molecules. This was one. And then building on this insight, I call them 2A and 2B, so there are two more insights. And 2A is that this colloidal particle is simply a big atom in itself. You know, it's just like an atom. There's no difference. It's just pushing around, and it's being pushed around. So you can see this as a big atom. And this insight is important because it's like a big atom in itself, pushed around, and that means that the statistical properties of these colloidal particles are the same as the statistical properties of your solution when they are in equilibrium, which they are. Okay? So this is, we are going to write down the consequences of this insight in a minute. But first, insight, which I call 2B, is that these water molecules, of course, I mean, you can now think, after what I said, it's a mixture of two kinds of atoms. The water atoms, molecules, and these colloidal atoms. Yes? I can try. Is it here? No? No. Yes? Okay. Good. Yeah, this bigger atom here is moving much slower than the small water molecules. They have the same thermal energy, but this is much smaller, so it's moving slower. And the collisions from the water molecules, they are so fast and complicated that I cannot keep track of them. But rather, the effect can be described probabilistically. Okay? That's the second main insight here. The effect of the water molecules on the colloid can be described probabilistically. Meaning that now I will come back to that. First, let's see what the consequence is of 2a. So from 2a, Einstein reasoned the following. Since these colloids are like atoms mixed with other atoms, and if they don't interact, if the suspension is sufficiently dilute, then they are basically an ideal gas. Okay, the colloids are an ideal gas. Meaning that they exert a pressure according to the ideal gas law. It's in modern notation, it's this. Einstein used a different notation because the Boltzmann constant, I think, was not defined at that time. So this is the temperature. T is the temperature. N is the particle number in the volume V. And P is the pressure. So from this I can rewrite it as P is equal to rho kBT. And rho is the density, N divided by V. And Kb is Boltzmann constant. It's 1.381 10 to minus 23 joule per Kelvin. As said, has not been defined at that time, I think, or not used at least in that context. So now, why is this an important insight? Because it gives us the possibility to connect the thermodynamic properties to the statistical properties in the following way. If this is an ideal gas and they exert a pressure, then a pressure gradient corresponds to a force these particles are exerting. So an osmotic force arises from, this is called the osmotic pressure in that context, by the way, from a pressure gradient. So this is K, this is the force. No, the osmotic force is given by the pressure gradient. Or in that way, if I write it like that, it's rather a force density. Okay, this has units force per volume. And this osmotic force is balanced by a viscous friction force coming from the solvent. So this is the only thing that can balance the force. And we know from hydrodynamics that this force density, rho times K is the force density, and this K, this is the osmotic force, is balanced by friction, which is proportional to the particle velocity. And this term here is a result from hydrodynamics. For a spherical particle, this is the friction coefficient in water. So you have a force which comes from a pressure gradient, osmotic force, which tries to move the particle, and this is balanced by friction, by hydrodynamic viscous friction. But from that equation here now, we see that this is also related to the density gradient with kBT here. We just use the ideal gas equation to plug in the pressure, okay? And from that, we get, from these two equations, we get that rho times V is equal to minus kBT divided by gamma d rho dx. Okay? It's just plugging in this k here and dividing by gamma. So, but this here, rho times V, V is velocity, rho is particle density, so this is actually the particle flux, the number of particles crossing unit area per unit time. But from the diffusion law by Fick, we know already what this is. Namely that it is the same as minus d rho dx from Fick, first law. And from that now, we conclude that the diffusion coefficient is given by kBT divided by gamma, friction coefficient. And this equation is called Einstein relation. And it's an extremely important relation because it relates the diffusion coefficient, which I observe phenomenologically, to the properties, to the thermodynamic properties of the system, namely the temperature here, which is somehow quantifying the fluctuations via the mean kinetic energy, and the gamma, which is quantifying the dissipation. So this is a relation between the fluctuations in the system and the dissipation in a way. So this is something which, an example for a more general class of relations, which is called fluctuation-dissipation relation. Okay, so this is Einstein's first result in that paper, coming from this insight here. And the second one where am I? Yes. The second insight here, that this can be described probabilistically. More specifically, the idea is the following. You have this colloidal particle here, and you measure the position after time intervals of length tau. And during that time, the particle has moved a little bit, maybe here, okay? And then you do this another measurement after another time tau, and so on. And because it's moving around by the pushes with the water molecules, this is like an erratic motion. And if this tau here is not too small, then we can consider these displacements being statistically independent. Okay, this is part of this insight 2b, that the motion is very complicated, but because of the fact that the water molecules are so extremely fast, they have practically no memory. Actually, the time scale of the collision time scale in water is, I think, like 10 to minus 13 seconds or something like that. So the water molecules, they forget very quickly about their memory. And so this tau, if it's a few orders of magnitude larger than 10 to minus 13 seconds, you can consider these displacements, these consecutive displacements, as being statistically independent. And this gives you a way to model this. So we consider a single time interval tau and write down the change of the particle concentration at position x after time tau has elapsed. And the changes, the number of particles, dn, which move by a displacement delta x between delta x and delta x plus d delta x is proportional to n and is proportional to the displacement. And then Einstein introduced a function here and said, okay, this is some function of delta x of the displacement, which is very narrow. It's different from 0 only for small displacements. And moreover, it's normalized. And this is basically particle conservation, and it's symmetric. Because these random displacements, they don't introduce a bias in the motion. If you don't have that, you would have a biased motion from these random kicks of the water molecules, which you don't have. And with this function phi here, we can calculate this thing. It's adding up all possible displacements when I start at position x minus delta x at time t times this function phi of delta x. So this function gives me a measure of how likely it is that the particle moves by a distance delta x. If I start at a position x minus delta x and I sum over all possible delta x, I get the density at x to that time point after one time interval tau. Now, as I said, both these quantities are small, tau and delta x, so we can expand the function in a Taylor series, the particle density, in both x and t. And so on. We can plug this into these integrals. And we get the following expression to lowest order, to lowest relevant order. Okay, these are on the right-hand side the two lowest order terms. This is 1 by normalization. This here is actually 0 because of the symmetry here. This is an asymmetric integral. It's 0. This term, when this is 1, drops with that term. So the next non-trivial contribution comes from this here, and this is plus d square rho dx square times the integral from minus infinity to plus infinity d delta x square half phi of delta x. Okay, and this here, if you now look at this term here and this term, these are the only ones which survive in lowest order. You actually get back the diffusion equation once you identify this here, this integral, which we don't really know quantitatively because we don't know what phi is, really. If you identify this with d. So from here, you get that d rho dt is equal to d square rho dx square. So from the simple observation that they are kicked around, these colloidal particles are kicked around by the water molecules, that I can describe this effect probabilistically by considering time intervals which are not too small, so that consecutive displacements are statistically independent. We arrive in a very simple way at the diffusion equation. So we see here that Brownian motion causes the phenomenon of diffusion. So this is the second great contribution of that paper, that actually Brownian motion, or this, Brownian motion has been shown to be connected to diffusion. And nowadays, we actually use the term Brownian motion and diffusion very often synonymously. Okay, and in the final step, Einstein solved this diffusion equation for a single Brownian particle. So solution for a single Brownian particle starting at x equal x0 at time t equals to 0. And this is simply a Gaussian. e to minus x squared divided by 4 dt. That is diffusion coefficient. I mean, so far, as said, we don't really know what this is, this object here. It's just a constant we call d. From Fick's law, we know it's a phenomenological quantity. Now we solve that equation for one particle, and then we can calculate the mean square displacement of that particle So we calculate x minus x0 squared averaged over many realizations of this process here. We start, every time we start here at x0, and we let the particle evolve and average over many realizations, which is equivalent of averaging over this distribution, and we get 2 dt, which tells us that the diffusion coefficient is given by the mean square displacement of the particle motion. So it should be more precise here, maybe x of t minus x0. So that actually gives us a way to measure the diffusion coefficient. We just have to record under the microscope the trajectories of the particle, calculate the mean square displacement, and that we get d. And then by that relation, we can, the way I wrote it now, we can calculate Boltzmann constant, but in Einstein's time, actually Perrin did these experiments and determined the Avogadro constant from that, which is contained in the Boltzmann constant. And for that, he got the Nobel Prize. And so coming back to the Action Lab guy, this is what he meant when he says, by observing this big particle wiggling, being pushed around by the smaller particle, you can actually tell something about the smaller particles. Okay? And this is that you can measure, the way I wrote it now, the Boltzmann constant or the Avogadro constant. So you can make a connection from the macroscopic to the microscopic world in that way. And this here has been the great contribution of this Einstein paper, that you make this connection. Around that time, there were many other people who started contributing to this understanding Brownian motion, Smoluchowski, many others. I mean, this is nicely summarized in this The History of Noise paper. And I think Rutherford, if I remember correctly, also derived this with similar arguments. Then Planck was involved and so on and so forth. So many people started to work on this. Okay, and in the lecture tomorrow, I would like to look into this. How can we write down an equation of motion for these kind of objects, which will give us, when solving, an actual trajectory of the diffusive Brownian motion of a particle. And then in the lecture afterwards, I will try to introduce how we can do thermodynamics on these trajectories. Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions?
In that equation, isn't you're considering that the concentration in the next times, discrete time, is the inflow from every single point towards X, right? Isn't there an outflow missing?
Here?
Yeah.
No, you integrate over all the possible delta x.
Yeah, but that's considering you are in other position and going to X, right?
Yes.
And then don't you have to consider that if you are in X, you have a probability to leave, so like an outflow, which would be minus rho of xt.
Minus?
Rho of xt outside than 0?
No. So in a way, this is contained in the value phi at 0. I think this is what you mean.
But I think the probability of staying in your position would be 1 minus phi of x 0, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I will go into
Yeah, okay.
what Einstein was trying to prove in the paper was the existence of or molecules or atoms. And in fact, I think the title was A New Estimate of Molecular or Atomic Dimensions.
No. The title was, I have it in German.
I mean,
but
he mentions in passing that this may be related to something that Brown discovered. He wasn't so familiar with Brown.
No, exactly, that's right. In his first paper, he was not aware of that. It was a later paper where he mentioned Brownian motion, actually. That's correct. Yes. That's right. I was a little bit sloppy on that. Yeah, in the first paper, I think he wasn't even aware, maybe, or he did not make the connection in any case. Yes, that's right.
So the x and x not over there is for the mean square displacement. That is just completely arbitrary, right? So the time and the initial position and then the final position, which is just arbitrary.
Right. Yes.
So, I mean, if things are moving like going to one place and going back to the place, so the time does not have to end when the particle has changed the direction.
No, not at all. No, you actually, if you like, the particle is changing direction infinitely often, or very, very often in a small time interval. So you don't even see that it's changing direction all the time. So it's a really diffusive process. So you have to think more in terms that you have the experiment start here, and the particle is moving, and then you repeat it and you record it very, very, very often, and you see a distribution of particles from that, or a distribution of trajectories.
Also, it's for a given time t, it's the like you get x1, x2, and then x2, x3, and x3, x4 for a given time t, and then you just average all of them.
Yes. Yeah. Or the mean square displacement, not just the positions. If you average the positions, it would be 0, because we don't have any systematic contribution. Okay, everybody's waiting for coffee. Okay, so let's have. Do you want to say something?
Yes. So let me just